What we will be doing now, actually, is allowing you the chance to expand further on that, and for John to do likewise on his own presentation, by having just a brief conversation between the two of you, about 16 minutes, and just to kind of explore the themes where, I suppose, where they align, but also where there are differences, where there are divergences. And following that discussion, then we will have an audience Q&A. So again, to everybody present, thank you very much. If you have any questions, if you could have them in the chat function, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. So we're going to split the screen. You'll see John and you'll see Anne. I will exit. And we're just going to have that discussion now. And if I can ask you, you're fine for now, but sometimes your audio is going in and out, so you may need to turn off your camera at some point. But okay. I'll let you know if that's
the
case.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Hi, John.
Hi, Anne. Listen, I really enjoyed your presentation as always, in terms of, it's a very radical idea that we're proposing. I mean, I'm obviously talking about post-growth, but at the macro level, but the micro level are the things you're talking about: sufficiency, enoughness. I suppose one issue I'd be interested in your response to, we have a cost of living crisis, a housing crisis, and it seems that the go-to solution is more. It's not sufficiency or post-growth. How do we communicate what we're talking about this morning in the context of the crisis that we're now, imagine you on Joe Duffy and me talking about post-growth and sufficiency, we'd be absolutely hammered.
Yeah. I can't imagine it, to be honest, to being on Joe Duffy. I think it's really important to have these big ideas ready kind of for when the seismic events happen. I think we are going to have more breakdowns. I mean, we're seeing them already. We're a little bit insulated from them in the rich countries, but breakdown is happening for people in other parts of the world already. The collapse is already here. So I suppose it's at those points that, you have to have the ideas ready in a way. And then you have to, really, we're standing in that gap all the time between what is and between the sort of the vision that we have and what actually is, what is and what might be. And that we have to just keep plugging away, keep showing up, keep turning up to the page really every day in the various projects that we're in, and just really try to keep spreading the word, and to kind of see, well, where are the openings? I'm self-educated in all of this. My professional background is in adult and community education. So I'm always looking for where are the entry points, which I think is what you're asking really, where are the entry points for talking to people about this? Like when the war in Ukraine started, in the community supported farm that I'm a member of, we experienced a big rise in people interested in being members, so every little thing like that. And also, I think we don't always have to use the big terminology, I think people come to it in their own ways, that the names aren't always the thing, so to speak. I think the pandemic showed up a lot of that as well, and for a while we thought something like a basic income would become a reality. Sadly, it didn't, because the forces ranged against us are very strong.
I think, what we're facing is an existential, unprecedented, confluence of crises. You mentioned the food crisis. The fact is that many of us experiencing the pandemic, certain supply chains were really badly affected. So I think part of the logic of our argument is about what I would call selective deglobalization. We need to have, much more emphasis on things like food sovereignty and energy sovereignty, having our dependence on food and energy in particular. They were the two major ones I would point out. If we're so dependent upon globalized supply chains for our food and energy, that means we're very, very vulnerable. And that, a sufficiency, enoughness, post-growth position is a risk management strategy. for people who don't know, in systems thinking, we got to understand, the climate system, the ecosystems and social systems. In systems thinking, what we need is to have a lot of inbuilt redundancy, a lot of slack. In other words, many of us know this from our own personal lives. When you're so maximizing and involved in efficiency in your own professional other life, you are wrecked, because all it takes is one shock and you collapse. I mean, that's exactly our current, systems of food and energy and the economy. And that actually the philosophy of enoughness and sufficiency is about making sure we've got a capacity to respond to shocks.
Yeah.
We're not so taught in our, efficient supply chains and productivity. So to me, it makes a lot of sense to have, as part of this conversation, this argument for selectively relocalizing food, relocalizing the economy where possible. Because I think, for what you and I are doing, I see it as kind of pioneering work. And it echoes in many ways, what the Bible says is that, without vision, the people perish. Where is our vision for the future? And for those of you listening, I mean, that's the provocative, gentle gift we're giving you, myself and Anne, this morning, is to consider, well, what is the vision for a future? And it can't be around continuing with the same old that we've had. So I wonder, Anne, did you have any other comments in terms of we're only offering the starting points of a much bigger discussion. I've mentioned selective deglobalizing and relocalizing our economy as part of the sufficiency post-growth argument. Is there anything else that you'd like to throw into the mix?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I really, really think the food thing is important. And I've just finished reading a book by Chris Smadge, A Small Farm Future. It's in the references on my slides. Really is about the relocalization, and the food is so central to it, that we really need to be having this relocalization where every local area really is supplying the food for itself. And I know lots of young people who want to get into that kind of work. So I was really taken by, I think you talked about work-rich societies, I was really taken by that. Because one of the things that Chris Smadge talked about is job-rich agriculture. Like, in this country, or in lots of countries, in the rich countries, we think, oh, it'll be brilliant. We'll create so many new jobs in technology, or we'll create so many new jobs in the bookmaking industry, the gambling industry, or we'll create so many new jobs in such and such a place. But if we talk about creating new jobs in farming or in horticulture, no, people think this is dreadful. I think we need to have far more percentage of the population involved in the production of food. Now that has all kinds of implications around land. It has implications about the kind of work we value. Is there implications for education, how careers education goes in schools, how young people are directed into what is valuable. And I loved you ended your presentation, John, with that quote from Wilkinson and Pickett about having come to the end of a journey. And you probably know the book, The Economics of Arrival, which, really is about, we have arrived. Can we just somehow have this controlled descent? It's really, rather than crashing completely, but I suspect that we're going to crash. And then you mentioned also that technology, so many people say technology will save us, but just think about it. Ecological agriculture is a technology in itself. We ignore certain kinds of technologies, and it's not to say we don't need all kinds, but we need the appropriate numbers and types of technologies. And I also really noticed a really common theme between us of morality, the need to put, as Richard Douthwaite said, he called morality the horse in the stew. He said we have everything in the stew apart from, in the economic stew, apart from morality, and that's the horse that needs to go in, the horse meat that needs to go into the stew. And the analogy of cancer, the pressures to grow. I mean, the notion of the overdeveloped world. And John, there was something else I wanted to ask you to from your own work that I know you didn't really refer to. I think part of what you say, if we were to have these political decisions to impose the kind of caps and so on that I have talked about, this could be done in a very authoritarian, draconian way, or it could be done in a democratic way. And you really emphasized the need for, what we need is more democracy. And I think you have written and talked a lot about civic republicanism, which I think is the kind of model that's needed if this is to be done in a sort of controlled way rather than the chaotic, haphazard way that it will probably happen.
I mean, in a way, you've raised a kind of a worry that I have. I mean, human beings are an incredibly resilient species. I mean, even a thermonuclear war between the US and Russia will not destroy all of humanity. And even a catastrophic climate disaster, we will, survive as a species. But what I really worry about is, and I echo here the wonderful Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, who wrote a book, The Human Condition, back in the 1950s. And what she said was, the cry for bread will always be issued with one voice. And what she meant by that is that if a society is facing an existential threat and the question is survival, you do not need democracy for survival. You do not need human rights. You do not need gender equality for brute survival. And it really, touches upon the point you raised there, that an authoritarian solution is all the more likely as a response to the climate and ecological crises that we've been talking about. The longer we delay and the worse it gets. And that's my real fear, that all the unfinished progress we've made on gender equality, on human rights and democracy, that a lot of that will go out the window when people are facing starvation, when they're facing, much worse, even cost of living crises that we're, currently experiencing. And that is a real worry for us, is that if we want to preserve our hard-won human rights, democracy, unfinished as they are, I mean, as I mentioned in my talk and I put in the chat, I'm interested from a civic Republican point of view of democratizing production as much as possible. Why should democracy end at the factory gate? Why should democracy end at the classroom door? Why is it that we tend to be satisfied with a view of democracy as something we do if we can be bothered every couple of years to vote? I think that the logic of sufficiency is also the logic of democratization, because once you introduce democracy into the workplace, it's no longer simply orientated towards production and efficiency. It is things like aesthetics that you mentioned. It is about joy. It is about the collective autonomy of workers coming together to decide what it is they want to do. So if you want a simple kind of civic Republican perspective on what we're talking about in a one line, I would say that what we need to be striving for now, and in large part for the ethical and political reasons that we've been talking about, is we need to democratize production and socialize consumption. Now, what I mean by that is, really on the latter part, is to complement Anne's focus, and she's done an awful lot of work with a former supervisor of mine, Professor John Baker, that some of you may know, but where John supervised me back in the 90s on universal basic income, is we also need universal basic services. So what I mean by socialized consumption is we need a lot more of a sharing economy, libraries, public transportation, not necessarily private. So to complement this democratizing, bringing the hard-won benefits of the still unfinished journey of democracy into production, into education, we also need then to see ways of sharing the goods and services that we need. Our current system, I often describe to my students, partly as a vain attempt to be a cool, down with the kids professor. If you see the film Lord of the Rings and the character Gollum, and it's all about my precious, that's what our culture has encouraged us to see as the good life, this individual, possessive, consumptive view of the human being. And I think most of us on this call today would see that as a very, imperfect at best, but actually quite dangerous view of the human being at worst. So we're not just talking about this morning, these big issues of the economy, our relationship with the world. It ultimately comes back to the most philosophical and most basic question of what is the good life for human beings? What is the good society? And that is inextricably an ethical and political decision. So it isn't just about science and the science of carbon and greenhouse gases, or economics and how we organize our economy, even though we propose policies, a land valuation tax and a carbon tax and so on. Maybe it is ultimately around those deep questions. What is the good life? Why should good lives cost the earth effectively? And I think we've given you this morning sufficiency on the one hand, and I think post-growth on the other. Therein lies the direction of travel for a good life in the 21st century.
If I can interject at that point, thank you very, very much, both of you. I have some questions from the floor. And on that point, now I have my own questions about when Lord of the Rings became cool, but we'll see. I might just leave them for now. So I suppose when you talk about democracy and democratization, and you mentioned, what we can do, or what can we do, almost a call for action as citizen leaders. But I suppose in order to see ourselves as citizen leaders, like how do we get to that spot? How do we become citizen leaders?
Yeah, it's the thing is, I think you don't always have to go. Well, first, it is a question of that ecological thing of understanding that every element in the ecosystem is important. However apparently ordinary or unimportant it is, every element is important and has a role to play. So there is that self-talk. There's not letting yourself get isolated, but talking to other people. That's part of the coping thing. And then you don't always have to go out and start something new. There's a lot of stuff going on already that you can join, So there are community gardens, and there are lending libraries and repair workshops and so on. So you don't always have to start something from scratch. But the other thing is really about getting together with other people. We can't do this alone. It's a collective endeavor. So we have to come out of our shells and not succumb to the paralysis of analysis. You can critique and critique and critique and really succumb to despair. So you have to do the resistance and the building with other people, and the coping too, the coming together in sort of conviviality and joy with other people. It's a really difficult dynamic though, and I think too, if we are going to join community organizations, we need to be looking to how democratically they're governed as well, not just in the workplace, but the governance in voluntary organizations. So it's really I always say enough is kind of a spiritual path too, because it's a question of taking the first step, and that's what spirituality is like. Really, you don't really know how it's going to pan out. And as Paulo Freire said, we make the road by walking. So you just have to do something. And sometimes the right thing to do is to rest, actually. You need to know when that is too.
I mean, Winnie the Pooh had a very good way of expressing what Anne has just said there. Sometimes I sits and thinks, and sometimes I just sits. And actually, sometimes removing yourself and being quiet and silent, that is itself an act of resistance. And as Anne said, resistance is fertile, not futile. And I think if I can think of some of the more practical ways that people can get involved, absolutely the lending libraries, repair cafes, community gardens are all absolutely necessary, because they give you tangible evidence that a different way of life is possible. But we also need to be engaged with existing very powerful organizations that currently aren't really putting their shoulder to the wheel. And I'll mention two. One is our faith communities, and ask ourselves, well, what would Jesus do in the context of the current crisis? I mean, it was mentioned at the start. I mean, one of the most beautiful and eloquent documents I've read in a long time is the Pope's Laudato Si from 2015. But I'm waiting for the action. In a way, Laudato Si is a bit like the Irish football team. Great on paper, less good on grass. So where does the action to follow up on that OC? So I think we do need our faith communities to get behind this. And that's what's wonderful about this morning. I see what we're doing this morning as that act of leadership and learning about these issues. And the second one is because partly I'm in industrial dispute with my employer, as are most of my academic colleagues across the UK. I'm a unionist, but a trade unionist in the context of where I live up here in the north, is there are no jobs on a dead planet. Where are our trade unions in this space? And so I do think it's not about reinventing the wheel. There are lots of already existing organizations. What's the GAA doing on this? There's an enormous, mobilizer of people, never mind a prodigious user of resources and energy. Are they talking about becoming more sustainable? And so for me, it is about simply sharing our stories. And if I just finish on this point, and it's rather unusual for a male academic like me to say this, we need to grieve and cry. In my view, the ways of life that I thought maybe 20, 30 years ago that my children would have, they are no longer possible. And that is a source of regret. And grieving is a natural part of accepting a very shocking reality. Is that, Kubler-Ross cycle, where you start off with denial, anger, frustration, grief, depression, and so on. And we need to integrate emotional responses into this issue, because ultimately that's the only way we're going to have, and it's uniquely something that we in Ireland should have in spades, is a narrative, a story. Partly what the problem is that the planetary crisis lacks a story. It's a scientific, technocratic one, or it's an apocalyptic doom and gloom one. I don't necessarily think that has to be the case. So it is about integrating emotions. So that's the heart, but also the head that we're doing today. And then, as Anne mentioned, the hand, the head, hand, the heart all have to come together in this.
Great. I mean, we have a number of members of religious orders here with us. So if any of you want to respond to what John is saying in relation to, that call to action, please do raise a hand or raise a virtual hand, and I'll come to you. Thank you. One of the other questions that was in the chat there, and it was for John, but obviously Anne, feel free to jump in as well. You mentioned that the workplace can become tyrannical because they prioritize efficiency. So would there be a benefit in prioritizing some concept of a common good for our workplaces rather than merely efficiency? And related to that, speaking about democratizing the workplace, is there a role for greater cooperative control of businesses, and not only worker-owned, but community controlled, with all relevant stakeholders having seats on company boards?
Great question, and absolutely. I mean, we've got to remember that businesses operate under a social license for society. They are given the rights that they have in terms of property or profit making and so on, because ultimately their role is to be beneficial to society. And I actually think many of the businesses that we've been talking about, particularly in the fossil fuel sector, and even more dangerously and worryingly in the food sector that Anne was talking about, they are no longer serving society. They are serving a small minority of very, very wealthy and rich shareholders, and they are not serving society. Therefore, we have every right to withdraw our social license. And that's why I do think, because I'm a socialist, I'll be upfront about my politics, the state has to come in and regulate businesses, put manners on them, make sure that they're adhering to the top environmental standards, gender equality and human rights, and that they're not only governed by their profitability. But in that context, and that's the state from the outside, that there is a genius in our workforces. Often some of the greatest innovations in production don't come from academics like me and so on. There are workers in the workplace who have tacit expertise. In other words, we should never think that just because somebody doesn't have a doctor in front of their name or letters after them, that somehow they're ignorant. There is tacit knowledge, lay knowledge and expertise. And I think, I gave the example in the chat of the Lucas Aerospace from the 1970s, when workers are given a different design problem, and to say, listen, the workplace, that you're currently producing widgets or bombs, what else can be produced using this same technology? It is that kind of swords into plowshares, and that's what that Lucas plan is quite inspirational about, the, you know, releasing, as I say, the collective genius of workers if they're given, you know, given the power, and they're not under this, in my view, tyrannical top-down way of organizing production. And it is also about bringing in aesthetics and joy. Why should work? And again, you know, work is often seen in religious views, Christian theology terms, as Adam's curse. And I think that is a terrible way of understanding what work is. Work should be joyful. Yes, there are times when it's a pain and, you know, it's a bit of a drudgery, but that way in which modern economics has interpreted that religious view of work as a negative, as somehow sinful, that the modern way economics views it, in case you don't know, work is technically viewed as disutility. You only do work if you're paid for it. And to me, that is such a negative view, or at least a partial view of what work could be. So I do think there's a philosophical, there's even theological elements of reclaiming work as joyful, but it has to be organized in a way that's about worker democracy, in my view, and away from capitalist exploitation and endless production.
One for you, Anne, if I may. You mentioned that most money is lent into existence. Is it possible to move to a post-growth world when our economic system is shaped by credit and debt?
Well, it has to be tackled. There's no, you know, I don't think so. I think the short answer to that is that we need to understand money. And I think that's something also that politicians on the left really need to get to grips with, is the nature of the money system. For us in Ireland, you know, we couldn't have a sovereign money system because we're part of the Eurozone, but there's a role there for the Eurozone ministers, and Pascal Donoghue is currently chairperson of that group of Eurozone finance ministers. So yeah, I mean, money is crucial. And I think that point from Margaret Kennedy's work about so much of the, you know, the expansion in the economy is carried on in order to service debt is really important. So, but I think there are things we can do. You know, you can have stuff like stakeholder banking, you can have debt jubilees and debt reconstruction. There are things we can do in the interim, but the money system really needs to be rethought. And there's been it's not that people haven't been thinking about it. The modern money theory people, Stephanie Kelton and her colleagues, you know, the ideas are all there. The big ideas are all there. It's really about the political will on the one hand, and then kind of grassroots pressure from civil society on the other hand. I suppose it's sometimes I am driven to despair. So sorry, everyone.
Which is fair enough. You know, I always think of, like, in the space that we work in, you know, you can either go to despair or anger, and anger is so much more productive. So I'll choose that and channel it. In terms of, you know, how we go about making all of this change, whether it's an individual or a societal, or critically a policy making level, like we see politicians coming out talking about the bounce back post pandemic and how we're thriving, and these indicators are showing how well we're doing on all of the various different indices, and yet we have 10,000 people accessing emergency accommodation, we have unaffordable rents, we have people in precarious employment, we have 580,000 people living in poverty. You know, how do we actually go about making that change? And a possible link to that question, and I have to ask it because John McGeady asked me to, could it be he is much maligned? It turns out, John, I can't believe my laptop doesn't want me to ask your question. Could it be that for all that he is much maligned, it turns out that De Valera was onto something with his emphasis on his vision of a self-sufficient country?
Wow, lot in there, but all very relevant. I mean, I think Dev and what happened in Ireland pre-1958, and the reason why I say 1958, that's when T.K. Whittaker comes along and Ireland then expands out to the world. And to me, that perhaps was a road that we may not have gone down the way that we have done. And then ultimately, you know, we're back to, you know, how do we organize our economy? And from a policy point of view, to me, there's a comprehensive failure of imagination within our policymaking community. We have the ideological dominance of capitalism and neoliberalism. We just have to name it in terms of that's what's going on. We certainly need pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, as the Italian Antonio Gramsci would put it. And as Anne said, the solutions are all there. My own view is that we have all the technologies we need to tackle the climate crisis. You know, the cheapest and most climate-friendly form of energy is, guess what? Energy efficiency, energy you don't use. But yet we don't get that enough in the media because there's no money, there's less money to be made in that. And that's why Anne's quite right to talk about the dominance of the financial system. I'll tell you a brief story as to why our real focus now from an economic and ethical point of view should be on the real resources of society. And it really illustrates the importance of understanding money. So the story goes of a German tourist going to Greece. He comes to a B&B and says to the Greek owner, there's €100. I'm going to go upstairs and look at the room before I pay. And the Greek person, that's okay. So the Greek owner goes to the shop, pays off his bill to the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper says, you know what, the farmer that I've been dealing with, I need to pay them. So he goes and uses that same German €100 bill and goes and pays the farmer. The farmer then thinks, oh, the teacher, they were doing some grinds for my daughter, I need to go and pay them. Takes the money, pays the teacher. The teacher then realizes, oh, that night I was doing the grinds, I couldn't get home, the bus was late, I stayed overnight in the B&B, I must give the money back to the B&B owner. Goes back to the B&B owner, gives the B&B owner the money, at which point the German tourist comes down and says, you know what, I don't like the room, takes the money. And that is how the modern monetary system works. The issue, money is a claim on resources. It has a social function. Our real focus should be on the real tangible assets of our society, the productivity of our people, the land and its capacity to either grow carbon or sequester carbon, grow food or produce energy. And in that respect, I don't think everything that those early Irish revolutionaries who created the Irish state were all wrong. In some respects, just to finish, you could say that the early revolutionary period of Ireland was post-colonial, whereas the new period now we need to deal with has to be post-carbon, and I would say with a view to another C, post-capitalist.
Thank you. And final word.
I think, it's important that enough, and what we're talking about isn't seen, and the degrowth and everything isn't seen about going back. It's not about regression, but it is about taking the kernel, the good bits of what was in the past and bringing them forward in a new way. So it's not about going back to some glorious past that some people think existed, or some supposedly glorious past that didn't exist anyway, but really about just really realizing what it is in the human wisdom traditions that can help us as we go forward. We have so many resources, as John said. And I think too, just in relation to the earlier discussion about democracy, people really need to learn to participate. Participation is a job of work in itself. And we need time. It takes time. And you have to kind of be able to reconcile things. You're not always going to find resolutions. It's always going to be messy and imperfect. But you just keep going. You dig, as Alistair McIntosh says, we dig where we stand and do just make the road by walking. We can't do anything else, really. And I think the projects that we're talking about, that the really good stuff that's happening, is a kind of a beacon to guide us, a model, lifeboats in a way for when things go wrong, the things that the knowledge is being developed and can be expanded.
Thank you. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to thank both of our panelists for today. Thank you very much, John and Anne. We're going to take a 20-minute break, but before we do, I just want to read out this comment by Anna Byrne, who's one of our participants today. A recent and wonderful example of enough is the video clip for the Angelus on RTE1 at 6 p.m. on Friday. Initially, the clip showed a man picking and cooking potatoes, now a farmer cutting silage, unfortunately changing to agro-business. But the men in both depict happiness and contentment. And maybe that is what we need to think of when we think about what we need for enough.